And do any questions arise as a result of that initial conversation?
Yeah, I'm curious about like the full spectrum of emotions. I mean, there's a few questions around it, but the first would be like tips for, really persistent, heavy, unbearable, or seemingly unbearable emotions, like tips for navigating that when that's arising and you're finding yourself amidst that.
Well, first of all, think of the spectrum of emotions as a rainbow. So begin to depersonalize it just a little bit. So in this moment, can you see or can you think of the spectrum of emotions just like a rainbow where each emotional tone, if you will, is vibrating at a different frequency. And then
Completely.
if you look at the spectrum of emotions in that way, what you'll notice is that resistance that you speak of begins to dissipate. You don't have resistance to red versus blue, but you do have resistance to hope versus shame. There's one that you're in resistance to. So it's not that the emotion itself is a problem. It's that your resistance to the emotion is the problem. When emotion arises in your body, there's a somatic feeling tone. There's an experience in the body. And if a human being would just allow themselves to just experience that as a sensation without the narration in the mind, then that emotion would quickly arise and then it would dissipate. But the problem with emotions is that humans hold resistance, mental resistance to them. They don't see them in terms of just an energetic frequency. And so the resistance arises usually because of the meaning that you give the emotion if you feel that emotion. For example, many people are resistant to feeling shame, or resistant to feeling sadness, or resistant to feeling depression because of what that means in terms of their identity. Because in terms of your culture, there's a cultural belief that if you feel certain emotions, there's something wrong with you. And that is just simply not true. There's nothing wrong with feeling the full spectrum of emotions, just as there's nothing wrong with looking at the full spectrum of colors in a rainbow. So if you release the mental resistance to feeling certain emotions, the emotions will quickly arise and dissipate, because this subtle body that is known as the emotional body is a self-healing mechanism. Meaning, just like a physical cut heals on the physical body, the emotional body is self-healing. But what prevents that healing process is this suppression of emotion because of the mental resistance to what that means. And you have to understand that most human beings are conditioned from a very, very early age. If you think of the term terrible twos, why do we label the twos to be terrible? Because the being that is 2 years old is just experiencing and expressing emotion. However, there's a mental label that is slapped upon it that it's terrible. So you're conditioned from a very, very young age that certain emotions are acceptable and certain emotions are not acceptable. And those ones that you have been conditioned to believe are not acceptable are the ones that you tend to have resistance feeling, not because it's so uncomfortable that you can't feel it, but because of what your mind has decided that means about you as a being. And this is why we said this week in one of the videos that your perception of yourself is really the most important and crucial perception to change. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Brilliant. Are these emotions that are coming up, are they also kind of like a GPS that helps us navigate to ultimately where we want to go? Or would you relate like
I would say that yes, you could consider emotions to be like a GPS, because the more comfortable emotions, the more high frequency emotions, are the emotions that we would say that occur physiologically when your energy field is more in harmony with source energy. So when your energy is connected to source and directed towards source, you feel certain emotions in your body, and those are the emotions that you would consider to feel good in your body. Emotions like passion and love and joy and happiness and well-being. The misperception, of course, in the collective consciousness is that these emotions are generated from the external, when in reality they are generated in as a result, if you will, with connection with source, if that makes sense. So all emotions are really just the physiological effects of the way the mind is directed. The way the mind is directed. However, as we've said in the past, you tend to, because you hold resistance to certain emotions, you tend to hold or suppress certain emotions and the thought patterns that accompany those emotions. You tend to suppress those in your energy field and not let them fully, fully integrate or fully complete themselves, right? Because again, the emotional body is self-healing. So if, for example, you experience a perception that is not aligned with source, for example, let's say when you are a child and you have an experience with a caregiver that is negative, and you come to the conclusion, or you create the perspective that says to the self, I am not good enough, that's a perception that is created in the mind, and the emotion that will accompany that perception is shame. And because you're not comfortable feeling shame, and because you don't have the capacity or the knowledge or the awareness to repattern that thought, meaning recognize that that thought is not alignment with source, that that thought is not true. So you would recognize that shame and that mental pattern as something that's not in alignment with source and repattern it. That's what you would do if you were conscious and aware. When the consciousness and the awareness is not of the level to complete that process, then that energetic pattern just gets stored in the energy field and it is suppressed, right? So you could say that there's no, as we said before, when you're thinking of emotions on the spectrum of a rainbow, there's no quote unquote bad emotions or negative emotions. There are just emotions that are the byproduct of mental thought patterns. Some of these thought patterns are in alignment with source. Some of these thought patterns are out of alignment with source. It's a spectrum, right? So in terms of using emotions as a GPS, when you have the awareness or the capacity to use them as a GPS, then yes, you do so. You recognize that this perception is not in alignment with source. I'm going to change my perception, and in doing so, my energetic pattern will also shift. However, there are certain circumstances that make it difficult to do that. For example, if when a person loses a loved one through what you would call the death experience, they experience the emotion of grief. Now, that emotion of grief is tied to the perception that their loved one is no longer there, which isn't actually true. However, we don't encourage you to shift that perception and emotion right away, because it's actually beneficial to feel through that energetic frequency of grief and loss, and then repattern the perception. Just because of how your physiology works, it's better to feel and release the emotion as it comes up. And once you have completed that cycle of feeling the emotion, then you can shift the perception. It's very difficult to shift the perception before that emotion has completed the cycle of arising and then dissipating. Do you understand what we mean by that?
Yes. Yes. So you were also mentioning control through this spectrum of emotions. I imagine like emotions and feelings more aligned with source aren't really controlling, but everything on the opposite end of the spectrum, fear, inadequacy, insecurity, anxiety, that sort of stuff is.
Well, it stems from the misperception that emotions are caused by a circumstance or a person in the external, right? So when a being holds the perception that the emotions are caused by something in the external, then they feel a need to control the external. But if they recognize that emotions are generated more because of the mental perception that one holds, and a being recognizes that they have full control over their mental perception, then there's no longer a need to control a person, a circumstance, anything in the external, because you have become the governor of your own mind. You can direct your mind, and in doing so, there's no resistance to experiencing certain emotions anymore. You see that they're connected to mental perception.
What is it with the it seems some of these qualities are more sticky than others, more addictive than others. Like there's a tendency for people to want to keep engaging them, watch movies, read books, just, keep
Definitely, it's because over time your physiology begins to memorize the physiological components of that emotion. So every time you experience an emotion, your physiology is actually experiencing a chemical reaction, if you will, and the physiology gets I don't want to say addicted, but the physiology becomes accustomed to that state of being, and there's momentum to that state of being, and then there's a resistance to shifting. There's a resistance to shifting out of it. A lot of that resistance is primal, just because in the primal aspect of the human being, there's a resistance to change, because the change sometimes has resulted in negative consequences, right? So there's a misperception, again, another misperception, that if I keep everything the same, that will create safety in my being. So even though the energetic vibration, the emotional tone may not be conducive to well-being or conducive to health, there's this gravitational pull to maintain it because of this psychological need for safety.